Welcome. Hi. Let me get the names down, okay? And we're covering Woodrow Wilson and the Great War, World War One. Great, Kennedy. Thank you. I doubly appreciate that, you being at work. All right. I get it. All right, let's see here. Great, great. All right. All right. So, are there any questions before we get into this? All right, and okay. Great. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and share the page. Wilsonian Idealism on Trial. All right. So notice the introduction. I don't have anything to offer that your other instructors have probably not provided already, have probably already provided, and that is that they put into certain like isms, the causes, the alleged causes of World War One. It's been a while. I was trying to find my undergrad study notes to no avail. So I'm going off of memory here, but with World War One, right, it's going to break out in the summer of 1914, and the United States is going to stay out of it until 1917. So it's from 14 to 18. We didn't get involved until 17, and we were proud of that fact under Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson was a Democrat, but he was the second president, like Teddy Roosevelt, who claimed to be progressive as a president. And he's going to have somewhat of a progressive agenda against big business. And he's responsible for the Federal Trade Commission and businesses putting in their information to him. The Clayton Act was big. The Clayton Act was, it put teeth into the Sherman antitrust law by giving specificity to it and giving examples of violations of the Antitrust Act. So the big businesses would be less inclined to get away with it. He also, but there are going to be some ironies connected to his presidency for sure, you know, because with progressivism, you contend progressivism is largely for bigger government, right? It certainly is not laissez-faire. But with Woodrow Wilson's rhetoric, what he claimed to stand for is he claimed to stand for kind of Hamiltonian means to Jeffersonian ends, bigger government involvement, but for an eventual result of less government involvement. Like, for instance, with the trusts, he wanted the government to come in and break up the trusts and restore the integrity and the opportunity of mom and pop entrepreneurs to be able to make it in our economy again, to restore competition and lessen or diminish the role and the reality of monopolies and the big rising gulf between the haves and the have-nots, etc. And he used the term liberty a lot for a progressive, because remember, to progressives, parity is huge. They want equality more than they espouse liberty. But with Woodrow Wilson, he wanted both. He wanted parity and liberty. And so there was a lot of kind of Whig rhetoric, WHIG, from the liberal Whig Party of England and our English political tradition through the colonial era, like in your 101 class. Um, a lot of that to his propaganda and to his rhetoric. But what he did, right, oftentimes was very heavy-handed, domestically and internationally. So it seemed a bit ironic hearing so much about liberty from this president. So when you get presidents like Woodrow Wilson and Thomas Jefferson, oftentimes the narrative that biographers choose to go, the route that they choose to take in forming a narrative and having some type of discourse, right, discussion on that given president, is they address his the fact that he was a bit of a paradox, his inconsistencies, the fact that he seemed to preach one thing but practice another. And that's what we have with Woodrow Wilson, a man riddled with contradictions. And so for one, I mean, it does stand for itself. He ran in 1916 again after winning in 1912 and contending he kept us out of the war, but he'll only keep us out of the war another year. So he did kind of stand up to that promise for a while and deliberately dragged his feet in joining this world war. But yeah, we're going to see other instances in which that which he espoused by the pen and by his lips didn't seem to materialize in the same manner. So at any rate, with World War I, you have the notion that Woodrow Wilson was a bit, he had this air about him. Critical people in the White House who had interactions with him, there was kind of a common perception, a negative perception, and it wasn't the only one. Like any human being, he had positive attributes, but one commonly espoused negative attribute that people attributed to him was that he kind of had a bit of a smugness to him. He was very well educated. He was, a Princeton man, although he was a Southerner from Virginia. He was an Ivy League man. He was a professor, an Ivy League professor and later dean. He published, got his PhD and published works in political science and so forth. So he had this kind of beam me up, Scotty, I'm not surrounded by any intelligent life here, kind of aura about him. And he kind of ascribed that to the events of World War I. To him, there was no great crusade being fought by any of the participants of World War I. They were scrapping and fighting with one another over other people's territory. He felt as if in his writings and in his quotations that this war completely could have been avoided and should have been avoided, that it was far from inevitable, and it was brought about by the failures and sins, because he had kind of a Judeo-Christian tone to his rhetoric as well. Some people even called him the pistol-packing preacher. That the sins of these rulers of these big European countries were responsible for this totally avoidable war. And so you get into the notion of imperialism, right? You look back at least as early as the 1890s and the carving up of Africa, and they're going to meet in Vienna and other areas in Morocco, etc. And they're going to literally, as if they're divvying up the prey, deciding to whom what parts of Africa will go amongst the European powers. So the French took North Africa above the Sahara Desert, with the exception of Egypt, which the English and the French almost went to war at Fashoda over. Of course, you have the Boer Wars down in South Africa between the Dutch and the English fighting over African territory. The Germans took Somaliland and Zanzibar and other areas of East Africa. And then you have the same going on throughout, back in their own home continent of Europe. So you look at some of these empires, right? Like the Austro-Hungarian Empire. You look at areas like Romania, Bulgaria, Serbia, Croatia, Albania, etc. Those lands are populated by distinctive ethnic groups and peoples who hold themselves to be autonomously different from their neighbors, and hence entitled to their own sovereignty, to their own autonomy, to be their own people, and to control their own destiny. And the Ottomans of Turkey, and then the Austro-Hungarians are going to take them over. And so imperialism is going to start a lot of drama with the colonized countries, because in return, right, a common reaction to that was nationalism, where the Serbs say, basically Serbian power. We want Serbia for Serbs alone. Ottomans and now Austro-Hungarians, get out of here. And needless to say, there were institutions and there were customs, etc., that the colonizers imposed on the colonized that were different from what they were accustomed to. So the Austro-Hungarian Empire was if my memory serves me correctly, they were Roman Catholic, the Magyars as well as the Austrians. They were Germanic speaking primarily. And so they're imposing their will on Serbs who were oftentimes from the Eastern Orthodox denomination of Christianity, with their own Slovakian language. So just that's going to happen all throughout the globe with colonization or imperialism versus nationalism. The people that are being taken over, it showed itself in the forms of literature. People wrote literary works, music, etc., about their homeland and wanting it for themselves and wanting to be free and remembering bygone days when they were free and independent as a people, to dress, language, and of course, political affiliation. And if and when, like the Austro-Hungarian Empire, before them, the Ottomans, refused to grant representation and refused to grant recognition to their political parties, to them, they would just form underground parties. So for instance, the Black Hand, right, was the organization that Gavrilo Princip was a part of, who assassinated the Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo. And so, so you have imperialism, you have nationalism of those who are being taken over, and then the imperialists fought with one another, of course. The Russians were trying to get their hands in close to the Dardanelles and to Constantinople or Istanbul area. They had their hands in Manchuria, and they were fighting. So did the Japanese, and they were fighting each other in the Russo-Japanese War, whereby they're fighting over land that either should have been autonomous as Manchuria, or had been long claimed before both of these countries had claimed it by China. And so they're going to, what they began doing is they start making these clandestine, these secret, hidden, closed door treaties, these contingency treaties, saying, what if my enemy won't allow me to have this land, and he begins to attack me, especially in the case of an attack, right? Will you be by my side? And it was under a quid pro quo basis. You scratch my back and I'll scratch yours. So France, right, and Germany were always going at it ever since the 1870s with the Franco-Prussian Wars. Prussia was the most militarily powerful and politically represented state of the 39 German states before they were unified in the 1870s as present day Germany. And so the Prussians really bullied, so the Prussians were German, they really bullied the French. They took Alsace and Lorraine, right, which would be vital even through World War II, as a thorn in the side of the French. They're going to take lands from Denmark and Austria, the Prussians that is. And so the French and the Germans, and at one point the prime minister of France had to flee Paris in a hot air balloon. And so there was a sense within French political tradition of revanche, of revenge, wanting to get that land back from Germany, of vital distrust and kind of a xenophobia, a fearful hatred of things German. And so the French allied themselves with the Russians. They had mutual interests, again, of quid pro quo fashion. So the French supported the Russians with their railroad, their Siberian Railroad and other ventures. And then the Russians supported France in Morocco and Tunisia, et cetera, and supported their claims there in support of one another, that if Germany were to ever try to bully France again in the near future, Russia would help defend France and vice versa. And the English, for a while, they literally used the term splendid isolation, that they were not going to get caught up in this high school drama. But it largely ended with a few international events that were kind of scary to them. They were known as the Moroccan crises, when Germany, despite their agreement that they would agree on who gets whose land in these congresses, these meetings of international diplomats and leaders of the European countries, and they were to do it peacefully. And the Germans threatened to attack the French in North Africa and Morocco, and they started mobilizing their navy. Also, the Germans engaged in an arms race with England. Very famously, a guy named von Tirpitz declared that Germany was going to outstrip England's navy technologically and militarily. And so then that really kind of called out England and made England in their political discourse very concerned about this upstart known as Germany needing to be put in her place. And so they left their splendid isolation and they formed the Triple Entente with Russia and with France. Remember, as a contingency alliance, right? Just in case war should break out, that they would have one another's back. And then with the Russians, right? The Russians, when you look into the Balkan area, here in the Balkans, above Greece, including Greece, and South Central Europe, the Balkan area, very heterogeneous, right? Very diverse. The Croatians are Roman Catholic, the Albanians are Muslim by and large. The Macedonians are separate from the other Greeks to this day. And so a lot of diversity between the Serbs, the Croatians, the Bosnians, etc. But one thing that they did share in common, again, was that sense of romantic nationalism from the Romantic movement. Italy will have this with Garibaldi and Cavour and their kind of George Washingtonian figures in Italy when they become a country in the 1870s and they kick the hated Habsburgs and other rulers out of Italy. And so there was a sense of romantic language and music and culture that was proliferating in the Balkans. And they were proud of their Slavic origins. And of course, what is the most powerful, arguably the most powerful modern Slavic nation? Russia. And so because of those cultural and historical and linguistic ties, Russia is going to make promises to Serbia that they will have Serbia's back as a small nation there in the Balkans. And so again, and it didn't help that the Balkans had about 3 years of independence. They got just enough time to have a taste for freedom and enjoy it, albeit they fought with one another and had civil wars during that time. And that helped convince the major powers that they were not ready for independence after they had broken free from the Ottoman Empire. So no more than about 3 years pass, and the powers that be in Europe decide that Austria-Hungary can take Serbia. And it's one of the many ironies of history is the Archduke Franz Ferdinand was sent there largely as a pacifying figure. He was for liberalization of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, for granting a voice, an elected position to her colonized people so that they could have a voice in government and have limited participatory power in the Austro-Hungarian regime, known as the dual empire of Austrians and Magyars. So at any rate, it's ironic that he was going to go and liberalize this area and grant certain rights and opportunities to the Serbian people, but he was seen as a Germanic, foreign Austrian, and what was worse, added to it, was that he was a Habsburg. And the Habsburgs, right, if you look at your early modern history from the Renaissance time period, at least that early, I think, through the early modern era, 15, 16, 1700s, the Habsburgs were just arguably one of the most powerful, dominating dynasties, family dynasties in European modern history. And so he was seen as this privileged, powerful autocrat coming in their territory. And of all times, in late June, when they were celebrating their own kind of Serbian culture day. And so Gavrilo Princip kills Franz Ferdinand and his wife, Sophia. They supposedly took a wrong left turn into a cul-de-sac, and they tried to U-turn, and he had him captured and from a coffee shop. And so at any rate, when that happens, thus spirals the events known as World War I. Is the Austro-Hungarians sent, the dual monarchy sent an ultimatum to the Serbian government underneath them, wanting all the information they had and all the known members of the Black Hand terrorist organization. It was an anarchist organization, to be handed over to them with all the paperwork to find out all the culprits and anybody even guilty by association. And they were going to, of course, bring in troops and put in forts, etc., and have a military presence there. And the Serbians became defiant. And that was largely because they knew they had the muscle of Russia behind them. But the Austro-Hungarians were not deterred by fear of big Russia, because they knew they had their Germanic cousin country and neighbor, Germany, to support them. So Kaiser Wilhelm II gives his support to the Austrian government and says, be as tough as you want, even mobilize your army and send it down there and crush the Serbian nation and army. Will support you against Russia. And then, of course, when that happens, Russia has the alliance of France and England to help her. And so then it just spirals out of control, and what starts as a little conflagration, a little grass fire, if you will, in Serbia, escalates into a world war. And so you have a famous December letter on December 18th, around 1915, by Woodrow Wilson. And you could see his tone in that letter, where he says basically, you guys are all fighting for the same thing, an enlargement of your own territory. You've been sucked in by your own secret alliances, and just let me come in and help arbitrate peace amongst you. And I have some, and he was already hinting at his 14 points that he'd become famous for as a US president to help keep this from happening in the future again. And of course, they decline, as you could easily guess, because the war is going to go on 3 more years and the US is going to get involved. And so why in the heck does the US get involved? Well, for a while, you could find evidence of Woodrow Wilson genuinely trying to stay out of it. He refused to read the newspapers because he thought that they were slanted with an inflammatory design to provoke anger and indignation and a desire for Americans to intervene on one side or the other. The McLemore resolution told Americans to stop, not to go anywhere near a war zone because, right, with the 5th and 14th Amendments, the government is constitutionally obligated or contractually obligated to protect lives, liberty, and property. And oftentimes that's been construed as including abroad. And so we didn't want to get sucked into a war by Americans getting killed out in the Atlantic Ocean, etc. So the McLemore resolution stated that Americans are banned from traveling anywhere near a war zone, especially in the Atlantic Ocean. He banned all loans to either side because he was afraid that whoever owed us the most money, we would be inclined to want to go and help out of self-interest alone because we want to be paid back our loans. And so oftentimes there is that simple connection in history. When where your money and pocket are connected, there your heart will suddenly flow in that direction during a war. But that didn't last. For a while it did, and then supposedly it came down to practical reasons, according to Woodrow Wilson, that he said we have to let our creditors lend to both sides, to either side, for the sake of our own economy. And his own Secretary of State, William Jennings Bryan, was not happy about this because he was afraid that we were going to get sucked in by lending more money, as he could foresee easily, to England and France than to Germany. And then hence that it would pull us to their side, wanting that money back. And so, so you have evidence of that. You also have the vulnerability of Wilson because his wife dies and he gets a girlfriend, and he starts showing, according to one book I've read, kind of erratic behavior, emotionally a mess from the loss of his wife, clinging to his new lady, being very impressionable. Either her name was Edith Galt, to her or by her, and a guy named Edward House, who was a close friend and confidant, who was not a member of the actual cabinet, but who he really confided in and listened to and so forth. And both of them, Edith Galt as well as Edward House, wanted him to go and fight and help England. And that's where it gets into the first section, is really to what extent was he truly impartial and wanting to stay out. So number one, you could derive from the title, Wilson's Whig inclinations rendered him pro-Triple Entente, not neutral. And so remember, with the Whig Party coming from England, the Liberal Party, they were for the incorporation of more and more rights, opportunities, privileges, and protections to the average common citizen of any given government, not just England's and the United States. And the Whig Party was for democratization, becoming more democratic by increments, by law, by one precedent in the courts, by one parliamentary law after another, but certainly not by radical revolution. That was seen as being very unsophisticated and barbaric, is to go to resort to warfare in violence and changing the law. but to change it incrementally on behalf of the common forgotten person, right? And so at any rate, when you look at the sides fighting, says Richard Hofstadter, again, I've mentioned this guy's name. His book, his writings are in the 50s and 60s. He's like the one exception, because most of the time people would say most history books, the interpretations therein are almost obsolete, written in that time period. People have already, kind of rebutted what they've said, or have incorporated what was valuable and discarded what wasn't already. And they've moved on to more modern historiographical interpretations. But like I said, he just has staying power, if you ask me. But Richard Hofstadter, in his book, it's called American Political Tradition, and I would highly recommend it. He has a different chapter on a different president, a different American leader, and he has a chapter on Woodrow Wilson, and he calls him a Whig. And he contends that when you look at the countries that are fighting, right, you got to think about, cui bono, right? Who benefits if either side wins? Well, if you look at the two sides, right, you look at the Ottoman Empire, they're still under Sharia law and the hadith or sayings of Muhammad, very old school. They literally had declared certain technological innovations to be of the devil. They did not give representation to the sub-ethnic groups underneath the Ottoman Turks. They did not have a representative body for the common people of the Ottoman Empire, nor a system of checks and balances that connected to the people below. And so hence, right, if you're a good Whig and you look at the Ottoman Empire, it looks archaic. It looks like from the Stone Age. It's not impressive at all. It's scary to think of them imposing that type of government on anybody else and spreading that type of government throughout the world. Then you look at the dual monarchy, and the dual monarchy, I've read people that have contended that the German parliament, if you will, that they had was a rubber stamping mechanism for the leaders. That it wasn't necessarily comprised of elected officials, especially in the upper house. They had a hereditary aristocracy still. And so you did not have representative government in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Oftentimes they had from anywhere in all their edicts, anywhere from 17 to 38 languages that they posted their edicts in, just to show the diversity of their empire. And you did not see representation for Croatians, for Serbs, for Bosnians, etc., under the dual monarchy. So likewise, and you still have an emperor that is not very modern and impressive according to Whig standards. And then you go to Germany. Yes, they have the Reichstag, the parliament, but again, you look at the upper house. The upper house were handpicked. It's spelled like Junkers, well-established aristocratic landlords, many of them Prussian, who could stop the lower branch of the Reichstag from passing popular legislation. You had a prime minister that was not elected, but handpicked by the Kaiser, the emperor. And of course, yes, you had an emperor still with a lot of patronage power of handpicking people in his cabinet, etc. So again, you could make the argument that Germany's republic was not very democratic at all either, and was very militaristic, etc. Look up Otto von Bismarck and the way he ruled that country as the prime minister, as a handpicked, unelected prime minister, as a case in point. Then, however, when you look to France and England, they had multi-party systems. They had parliamentary elections. The major electoral winner party got to decide its own prime minister. So in a sense, the prime minister was popularly elected. The King of England or Queen of England was a figurehead largely by this time, long after the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution and other things that had happened to ensure that that Parliament ruled England, not the king or queen. And so with number one, that's what we're contending here. Richard Hofstadter's contending is Woodrow Wilson was most impressed with England and France, and he wanted to ensure that they won because he thought that would be best for the world, for their system of government, for their type of institutions, for their type of society to be emulated throughout the world, so that there was much at stake for the thought and the fear of these backward, militaristic, undemocratic, unrepresentative governments fighting against the Triple Entente if they should win. And so hence that he may have been looking for an excuse to go to war to help England and ensure that England and France prevailed. And so you have violations of international law. You have the 1909 London Accords, and they contended, right, that there ought to be freedom of the seas as long as it wasn't contraband that you're selling, as long as it's not like arms and ammunition. You should be able to sell textiles, clothing, cotton, food, right, to any country you want that's at war, or all countries for that matter at war. And England and France were both violating that. Neutral merchant vessels, private merchants, were sailing through the Atlantic, and they were being stopped or attacked by the English and the Germans during this war. The English, right, were stopping ships and confiscating their goods, their products. And we're not talking about contraband. We're talking about cotton and almonds and clothing, etc., non-contraband stuff. And so they weren't supposed to be doing that according to the London Accords. And we turned a blind eye to it. We kind of just smacked the hand of England and said that that's not right, reminding them of the Accords, told them, that we could put certain sanctions on them if we wanted to, but that seems to have been about it. Made a couple demands of remuneration, of them paying us back for the money lost from our merchants, having it confiscated, because they were trying to starve their enemies into submission, right? So the English were trying to keep food and clothing and everything from getting into blockaded Germany, and vice versa. But the Germans were using the Untersee boats, right? The U-boats, the submarines, and they were engaging in indiscriminate attacks in certain war zones. Instead of putting up the periscope and seeing and delineating friend from foe, right? They were just attacking at will. And so they were killing innocent people, innocent merchants, cruise ships with their passengers, etc. And so Woodrow Wilson took a much harsher stand towards the Germans. And as you could guess, his rationale is that English violations are taking away money and products, but German violations of international law are taking away sacred lives. And William Jennings Bryan, who was a Dove, who wanted no part of this war, at this point, he resigned as Secretary of State because he foresaw that Woodrow Wilson was pushing us toward war against Germany. And so they give us the Sussex Pledge that promises that they will no longer engage in indiscriminate submarine warfare. And it lasted for a little less than a year. And they're going to announce the reinstitution of indiscriminate submarine warfare. And when they do, that's when Woodrow Wilson asked Congress to go to war, and they pass the resolution. And so that's the official reason we went to war, were German violations of our international rights on the high seas, namely the submarines attacking ships that were killing American citizens. So you have the Arabic, the Sussex, the Lusitania was the most famous or infamous, and yeah. So at any rate, that's the official reason that we go to war. So number two, when we go to war, right? To what extent did Woodrow Wilson feel as if circumstances beyond his control almost coerced him, put pressure upon him to violate his own rhetoric as a politician, to go against what he had preached for so long? So that's something to think about. So for one, right, he asked for volunteers to fight. He gets nowhere near the number of doughboys as the other countries' soldiers called our American soldiers. Gets nowhere near enough doughboys. And so he resorts to a draft. He didn't want to, but he did. And so that's a very coercive practice, right, of forcing people. And at any given time, some people in the New York Herald were saying that 90 of the first 100 men drafted evaded the draft, and you could be incarcerated for up to a year for being caught avoiding the draft. And so that's one thing. He had conscientious objectors, right? The Mennonites and the different German Protestant denominations that were against that, for whom war is against their religion, literally, who are pacifists. Woodrow Wilson kind of kicked the can down the road, and he let local boards do the drafting instead of one coercive federal agency doing the dirty work itself. And so it varied from local area to local area. But in some local areas, those who claimed conscientious objections were ignored, were persecuted, were forced in to fight, etc. Then he says, we need as many goods as possible to fight this war. And so he develops the War Industry Board, right? And the argument is, right, is efficiency, efficiency, efficiency. We need as many tanks, because we used French tanks for much of the war that we fought. When we finally got involved, we weren't prepared. We weren't ready. We need as many tanks constructed as possible, as many Enfield rifles as possible, because some of our boys in Tampa Bay and other areas where they were training on U.S. soil were training with sticks. We clearly were not ready. And so to him, right, you can't go to mom and pop shops and make thousands of separate contracts for these guns and tanks, etc. It's not realistic. It's not efficient. So who does he go to? The very robber barons whom he had vilified and said he was going to, take their teeth from them so they can no longer gobble up their smaller competitors. Now here he is enriching them with these lucrative war contracts to make tanks and guns, etc., for him and for the U.S. government. But again, he contends, what options do I have? And so he makes this financial relationship, this mutually beneficial, supposedly, financial relationship with the robber barons. And so how ironic, right? And to alleviate his conscience, he had some of the labor union leaders decide what corporations would receive a contract and which ones wouldn't. So hence, if you had a bad reputation for the way you treated your workers, they would not allot you a contract. Also, you had to pay minimum wage to your workers if you had a contract with the government, including equal pay for women with a minimum wage, etc. But at the same time, right, what happens in Bisbee, Arizona, in Montana, and in certain areas, according to Howard Zinn, these workers began engaging in espionage in the facilities and begin sabotaging the equipment and going out on strike at key times when their labor was needed along the assembly line, because they were philosophically against this war, right? Because you got to remember, a lot of the common workers at this time did not, the mainstream American Federation of Labor, the Knights of Labor, all they wanted was a slight increase in wages, a slight amelioration or improvement in their working conditions, and they accepted the status quo. To a lot of American workers, we have no idea at this time period how diligently and oppressively they worked and the type of conditions that existed in the factories and in the mines, etc., at this time. So to a lot of them, there was not a lot of appeal, much less, especially if you were an immigrant, and America had so many immigrants, you were not welcomed into the American Federation of Labor or Knights of Labor, etc. And so there was a large appeal for Marxist-like labor unions. One was the Industrial Workers of the World, known as the Wobblies. And they promised, that the workers themselves, their ultimate goal, I believe, was like syndicalism, where the workers in each area and in each factory control the means of production and control the allocation of the resources eventually, and in a democratic manner and decentralized manner. And so it was kind of utopian, right? Like making heaven on earth for workers. So with the Industrial Workers of the World and other organizations like that, that were highly represented amongst the workers, they had the powers that be, Big Bill Hayward, Emma Goldman, and these other big wigs of the Wobblies. They had decided that this war was a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. And so a lot of the labor unions ended up going against this war. And so when that happens, right, and they know just exactly what they're doing, and they engage in sabotage just at the wrong time, when production is greatly needed, right? To Woodrow Wilson, this could mean the difference between winning or losing the war. So he didn't mess around. He asked for sweeping powers from the Supreme Court and from Congress to engage in basically a red witch hunt against any type of Marxists that were sabotaging the war effort. And so in Bisbee, Arizona, they just brought in the local police, hauled in all the workers from the workplace, and drove them out in the middle of the New Mexico desert and let them go. They put them on a railroad and marooned them out in the desert. And you have what exacerbated it is you had some famous occasions like the what was it? Like I said, there was sabotage of equipment. There was an assassination of a superintendent at one of the factories. And then, of course, there was the bombing of Palmer, of A. Mitchell Palmer. And he was kind of the beginning of a predecessor to the FBI. And someone they believe connected to the Wobblies blew up his home. And he received a blank check from the Supreme Court to go after the Wobbly offices. So they went after, just in a matter of days, they went after like 48 different offices, arrested everyone. They deported like 248 Russian Wobbly leaders, had them deported back to Russia, I believe, including Emma Goldman. And it was a big witch hunt, Red Scare, as they call it, the first Red Scare. And so how ironic, right? This guy is about the autonomy of the individual, the rights of the forgotten man, liberty, right? Despite being a progressive who's for bigger government, that bigger government is a means to an end, right? To almost a libertarian end of smaller government and more individual freedom. but look what he's doing. And, anti-big business, and he's making big business rich with the War Industries Board. And also, as an intellectual, he was for the intellectual autonomy of the individual and the First Amendment rights of the individual, the right for us to be free-thinking individuals as American citizens. And then he institutes the Committee on Public Information. And the Committee on Public Information was basically a propaganda machine. They sent forth like 75,000 speakers. They went to the Nickelodeons, the movie theaters, and all kinds of public events and private events, and gave speeches that were very almost coercive in nature, very manipulative. Just, if you love your country, you will buy bonds. If you love your country, you will tell of any instances and report any instances of disloyalty. And speaking of disloyalty, he went to the press and asked them to engage, excuse me, in self-censorship. I believe he literally used that term. And he said basically that if you find information that impugns the federal government and what it's up to and what it's doing, then you should keep it to yourself and not publish it. And you should, your writings should be, they should foment, they should bring about patriotic pride and a sense of obligation and so forth. And so they began rationing things, right? And we rationed things in World War II as well, but certain products were rationed, and there weren't to be any complaints about that. And with the press is he has the famous Espionage Act passed by his Congress. And the Espionage Act stated that if you did anything to impede the war effort, to get people to join the armed forces and fight, to make sure that productive, guns and tanks, etc., were produced in a timely manner, then you could be arrested and fined under the Espionage Act. And there were leagues that were kind of proliferating around the country known as patriotic leagues. And they were almost like vigilante groups, especially in the Midwest, where they began attacking American Germans, German immigrants, members that were people that were connected to the Wobblies and radical unions, etc. And so instead of trying to put a lid on that, right, which could become a scary force as far as, setting a precedent for future generations of tolerance, Woodrow Wilson sanctioned the patriotic leagues and asked them to inform the government in any cases of disloyalty, etc. And so how ironic, right? This Ivy League intellectual for individual liberty, autonomy, etc., is doing all this stuff. But again, right, I try to take it easy on him regarding this hypocrisy. And number two, in contending that Woodrow Wilson felt compelled by circumstances beyond his control to go against his own rhetoric. All right. And then needless to say, ultimately, what he did not do successfully is implement the 14 points. And I have them above if you want to look at them. But it's very arguable as far as how the degree to which it was his fault. When he went to Versailles at the end of the war, there's evidence that the other European powers of like Clemenceau of France and the English government, etc., they saw him as a late coming interloper. Like, who are you? We fought from 14 to 18. You didn't even help us until 17. And you think you're going to dictate the peace terms to us? So his idea about the sovereignty of all people, have a referendum and let them decide what, as far as self-determination as to who rules over them as a people, it just didn't happen. And as we see, things are going to happen at Versailles instead, that arguably led to World War II instead of preventing future wars. And by the way, just as an aside, I'll try to be quick here and try to sum this up quickly. Okay, I thank you for your patience. But as a quick aside, during the war, we did fight rather well. A few places to mention are Cantini, the Montdidier sector, Soissons, the Vale River, Mount Falcon. Our Marines became famous at Belleau Wood, where they were called devil dogs by the Germans. Chateau Thierry, we fought well. Saint Mihiel, and then ultimately the Meuse Argonne. Those are the names of the two major rivers. The Meuse Argonne offensive. We had 1,200,000 doughboys fighting in that offensive alone, and so our numbers did matter. It did help turn. I don't know if I'd say turn the tide of the war, but because it was kind of arguably at a stalemate. But it helped secure Allied victory. Our numbers alone going over there. Controversially, he gave automatic, at one point, automatic officer positions to college-educated young men who didn't know anything about actually fighting in war and so forth. So there was friction between our officers and our foot soldiers, and there were instances, kind of like Vietnam, of strife and even violence between the two. There was drama about us being under Ferdinand Foch, F-O-C-H, a French commander, and there were accusations that Ferdinand Foch, who was resentful that Americans took so long to enter the war, was throwing Americans into harm's way first and foremost amongst the soldiers that he had access to, almost resentfully, and overly recklessly. And so we had issues with that as well. Yeah. So anyway, I don't want to keep you any longer. But are there any questions? Do you guys feel like you have can I get a thumbs up from anyone as far as just a basic grasp of what I'm asking you? Thank you, Rudeep.
I did have a question.
Yes.
You had talked about Woodrow Wilson being like an academic. Academically, how did he compare to Teddy Roosevelt?
Oh man. You know what? I mean, oh, that's tough. First of all, he from what I read of, like I said, from take this lightly, okay? Because I'm not an expert on this field, and I apologize, immediately for that. But from what I understand, trying to compare and contrast as far as making a general conclusion of that, both of them were academics to the extent in which what they wrote was not necessarily immediately imbibed by the common population. The War of 1812 naval history by Teddy Roosevelt largely was kept a reserve of academia to read. Woodrow Wilson got a lot of accolades for his published works in political science, but the common person, as far as access to it and imbibing it, didn't really happen. So I'm not even sure where I'm going with this, but just but I would maybe make the argument that Teddy Roosevelt was more in tune with those, what I generically call the dangerous ideas that were disseminating at the end of the 1800s and the first decade of the 1900s, like social Darwinism, uh, Malthus, uh, uh, yeah. So I would make the argument that Teddy Roosevelt was more known for imbibing the ideas of his time, including Nietzsche and other people and so forth. And Woodrow Wilson was a little bit more academically distant and myopic, and just adhering to much older sources and sticking to political science. But maybe I'm not being fair to Woodrow Wilson. They both were incredibly well-read, well-respected, and received accolades for what they wrote. But yeah, I just think more Teddy Roosevelt, he just had that connection to the ideas that were prevalent in his day, and also just his populism of his appeal and the way he ran for office and so forth. He seemed to be more in touch with the pop, and that could be good and bad, right? More in touch with the popular sentiments of his time period, of his generation, and so forth. Whereas Woodrow Wilson was more a typical academic behind the what's that expression they use? The marble citadel or whatever. Yeah, I'm sorry, Cody. I wish I were better versed and better prepared for that question. That was a great question and not so great of an answer.
No. That was a great answer, Professor. Thank you. I'm always learning something from your answers, so don't apologize. One more thing though was for Roosevelt. Do you know what college he went to? Sorry.
Roosevelt went to Harvard.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, Roosevelt went to Harvard, and Woodrow Wilson went to Princeton. Yes, sir. All right, but thank you, Cody. I always appreciate you guys' questions. Anybody else? All right, so I'm seeing some names that I didn't see before. I want to make sure that I have everyone on here. All right, I think I have all of you now. Well, again, you guys, I can't thank you enough. I can't begin to express how eager I am to meet in a classroom again. And I wish it were with you guys. I really do. So I hope you're doing well. I greatly appreciate your coming and hanging in there for this lecture. Happy to give you your extra credit points. And I look forward to what you write, reading what you write.
Thank
All right.
you.
Thank you. Okay. You
Thank you,
guys
Professor.
have a great day.